play is almost like a ritual. And if you look at the origins of theatre, when we look at, for me, it came from, sacrifice. Years ago, ritual ceremonies, religions. There's a sacrificial, ritualistic element to theatre where you repeat the same thing again and again and again in the hope that you get some grace. And that's what theatre is to me. Years ago, we did a play of mine called Bombay Black, which we did. It premiered in Toronto, and then we translated it into Hindi, and we did it in India. And there's a moment in the play when the main character, she wants her husband's, she's plotting her husband's death, and she wants revenge on him. And it doesn't happen. Someone else comes with his ashes, and he's died a natural death. And so she doesn't know what to do in that moment when she has her husband's ashes in an earthen pot. And in the play, she takes the ashes, and suddenly she starts, doing that with the ashes, and she's speaking to her husband. And suddenly the entire theatre, I was in the audience in Bombay, and the entire theatre went silent, and you could hear them go, oh, they did that. And I never experienced that moment again. With that intensity.
But that's what you're always aiming for.
And that's what theatre does. Yeah. You may never get that moment in the same manner. You'll get it in a different way. But that's what I love about theatre. And I'm glad we're talking about plays, because in the audience this evening is Bill Millard, who was the artistic director of the Arts Club for over 4 decades, and he really gave me my start in theatre. And years ago, now we're sort of seeing more South Asian playwrights, but 20 years ago he produced a play of mine that was set in a brothel in Bombay's red light district. It was a very brave choice, and I don't think the Arts Club ever recovered. So thank you, Will.
I had one moment at a university once where just some university students performed a scene from one of my novels, and I was sitting in the audience and I just had goosebumps that this thing that was just existed in my imagination, that other people had grabbed hold of it and made something of it and spent their time and it turned it into this 3-dimensional on-stage thing. So I can't imagine how exciting that must be to see a whole play performed by professionals. Something that exists as a kernel in your imagination then turned into...
It is exciting, but the excitement happens only, more than excitement, it's either electric or it's not. You know what you've written, and you can either feel that moment in the theatre. It happens on opening night, sometimes it won't happen for the next 3 shows, it'll happen again. But it can also be very difficult, because theatre is a collaborative art, and I think it requires harmony. It requires perfect alignment, not just of the writing, but direction, sound, light. Everything has to come together and has to be in unity and alignment for us to feel the force and power of the work. With this, it's all in here. Yeah. There's the reader's relationship with the text, but in theatre there's something that's I don't think there's any other form that does that for me.
And you never get that moment of electricity when you're watching a rehearsal or when you're watching start
performing.
Oh, you do?
No, you can feel it sometimes when an actor does something that surprises you. Sometimes actors will make choices that, they'll just add something that pushes it and gives it even more meaning. So you keep finding those moments, but it can also be devastating when you see something on opening night and that's not what you've written. And you're watching your world fall apart, you get sick, and it's happened, unfortunately. I've had more great production, like I've been lucky, I've had some wonderful people that I've worked with, but there have been times when you don't want to be there.
I want to talk about that in a second, but...
I don't really.
That's what I want to. But there's a moment, because these stories some of them are quite autobiographical, there's a moment where there's a dramaturge in them. And I can't even remember if that, because there's 2 parts of the book that are more autobiographical, and then the rest is more fiction, but you're kind of left guessing a lot of the time what's fiction and what's autobiographical. But tell us about the dramaturge in that.
Yeah, her name was Iris Turcotte, and she was, so a dramaturg essentially is to a playwright what an editor is to a novelist in that sense. But Iris was a very special, person. She used to smoke all the time, and all the notes that she gave me were, accompanied by plumes of cigarette smoke. So even I would smoke with her, and she was one of those people who you either completely got along with instantly, or there are many playwrights who they were quite terrified of her because she would just tell you, what she thought. And it's people like her who really, and Will and Rachel Dider, who was another dramaturg and director, and you meet these people who understand your work and help elevate it, right? They help you with their experience through craft. Many of the people I've worked with haven't been to Bombay, but that's my domain. I don't need that. What I need is their experience and their wisdom. And Iris was wonderful. She really was a force.
And the quotation you have from her in the book, it's that she sounded like she was really good at taking a play, like there's the content and there's a plot and there's a character, but she was really good at seeing right through that and getting to the kernel of what the play was about.
Yes.
And would she sometimes see something that you hadn't seen? Like when she said, I think she says, "Listen here, asshole, this is what the play is about."
Yes, that's what she would, that was her favorite word.
So when she said that, did it ever surprise you? Did you ever be like, "Oh yeah, that's what it's about, I didn't realize"?
I'm constantly surprised by what, people find in the work, which is what I, like thematically I might think it's about, for example, the stories about betrayal and forgiveness. And sometimes readers will point something out that I find, okay, I understand what it means to them. And initially one day, a dramaturg of mine, Rachel, and she said to me, "You write a lot about body parts." And that had been like dismemberment, castration, amputation, and I didn't realize I was doing that, but I was. It didn't even occur to me.
It's your race to the parking lot to get out of here. The buffoon, I had not read a play for a very long time, but I wanted to read this before I met with you, and I really enjoyed reading the play, partly because I like thinking about how much control you're leaving to other people, because as I said, this is a really sad play. It's so poignant. It's about a clown, but it's very sad. But as you said, the physical part plays off it to make it less sad in person, or at least it balances the sadness of humor. But you're trusting someone else to pull that out of it.
You have to. In theatre, you have to trust. That's the main thing. You eventually have to let the work go. But if it's not there in the text, they can't bring it. They can't create something that isn't there. They can enhance it, they can interpret differently, they can help bring it to life, but you can't really create something that's not there in the text. But with Buffoon, it was an interesting process. This was a play that was commissioned almost 15 years ago, 16 years ago by the National Arts Centre in Ottawa. And I always was fascinated and intrigued, and the circus had a pull. Because as a child, I remember going to see the Great Russian Circus in Bombay. There wasn't anything Russian about it. It was just called the Great Russian Circus. It's just that there was one, I think, strongman who was maybe Russian, but I remember seeing it as a kid and feeling confused. Because on the one hand, it was magical and it was what you expected it to be as a child, and yet when you saw the performers, they weren't, they were injured. Some of them were limping, their clothes, the animals. You looked at that, and I think that dichotomy is what stayed with me as a child. And then at the same time, I had a grand aunt who was a very good artist, and she used to paint these portraits of clowns. And she had a townhouse in a small town called Dhanu, 2 hours away from Bombay. And as a kid, I used to stare. There were 2 portraits. I used to keep staring at this one clown, and I was completely transfixed with his eyes, And she would always tell me the eyes are the hardest to paint. And when I was alone in the room with that clown, it's almost as though I wanted to go behind the painting and see who are you, And really, that's what writing is about. You have something, and then you ask yourself, what's behind this? What does it mean? Right? It's never about, this is never what it is. It's never that. You kind of want to do that always as a writer. And so with this play, I think when I wrote about a family who owned a circus, and it was a very surreal kind of play. And I worked on it for many, many years. And then I got offered a production by a theatre company in Toronto, and I said it's just not ready. And
was that hard to say that?
No, because I realized that they loved it, but I said it's not ready, and I don't know what made me say that. And then for years I didn't look at the play, and then when I went back to it, the clown sort of walked out of the play. He said, I want nothing to do with my family, this is a one-man show, it's my story. And that's when, and I love it when that happens, if you allow your characters to talk to you, they will reveal their true nature and they will betray their own family. And he sort of walked out of the play, and that's when I realized it was a one-person show, and I'm a huge fan of one-person shows like Ronnie Burkett and Matka Morris Spanish. I love some of their one-person shows, but I gave myself a very strict strict guidelines for this. I said I only will do it with one chair, no props, one chair, one person. That's it.
So you do have a lot of control as the playwright.
That's the discipline, but after that you have to hand it over to a director and an actor, right? But it was it's a story in which essentially everybody leaves. It's about how this boy is born as a child of the circus, to trapeze artist, and eventually he becomes a clown. And again, when we talk about fiction, I think fiction is really deeply personal, and there are moments in this there's one moment that actually happened in the play that was my birth. So a few years ago, many years ago actually, my mom told me about how when she was 19 when she had me. And this was in Bombay, like 1974, her water broke and she didn't know. Like she was too young though. She was alone in the house. So she called her mom up and she said, I think something's happening, and no ambulance. They had to drive, pick her up. And by the time she got to the hospital, I was halfway out between her legs. She was walking up the stairs. And that's what I used in
That's really
in
interesting
the play.
the way it
So
plays out.
the clown it starts with his birth, and he's upside down, and his mother's telling him, well, come on out, you little shit. And he says, well, I didn't like the way she spoke to me, so I just went back in. And so you sort of use details from your personal life, but everyone, it's fictional, but that's what I mean when writing is deeply personal. It's not autobiographical, but there are moments in there that are very much me.
We were talking about that in the writing group, that if you don't put something of yourself into it, it lacks emotional intensity. So even when you're writing about a world very different than yours, you have to draw on some of your most painful, vulnerable, saddest, happiest, whatever moments to get that real emotion into a story, even if it has nothing to do with autobiography. Yeah. When you said the eyes are the hardest part to draw, I wonder if there's a parallel sentence to writing. If you're going to say that such and such is the hardest part to write, is there a sentence that parallels that?
Character, I think that's for me it's all about that, and it's really hard because the minute you start writing plot, for me I start failing. That's the beginning of failure when I start chasing plot. I always say that it's like in every family there's that one family member who says, well, I can fix that, let me fix it, and that's plot. Because he makes it worse. He always destroys everything that he touches. And so the minute you start writing plot, I can tell when I'm doing that. And I just stop writing.
You just made me remember this one time my ex-husband went out to our backyard and there was a mess of wires, and he came back in and he's like, I fixed that, and then I picked up the phone and there's no phone. He fixed the wires, he cut them. Yeah, that's a family member.
I wouldn't even try.
Don't try.
I have no skill actually I have no other skill, let me put it that way. To be honest,
writing, that's it?
That's about it.
Well, thank God.
So when people say, why did you become a writer, I think probably that's the only thing that I can do.
And we're going to get a very close insight to you becoming a writer in a minute when you read, but first I want to talk about the pull between India and Canada, because that's a unique way that you live. When I last talked to you, you were living 6 months in India, 6 months in Canada. I think that shift has changed, but you still have two homes. You're very much pulled between two homes. How much are you living in each right now?
I think I'm living in both all the time. and that's not a good thing. But ever since I moved in I think the late 90s and 98, I didn't really realize what homesickness is, or what home means. You never question what home means until you leave it. You know? And I left Bombay and came here when I was 24. And the first 2 years were really, really bad, I think. The first few months were okay, and then it kind of hit me what I had done. And it wasn't until I actually started working at the Arts Club Theatre as a summer intern to Will that I found home in theatre. I found home on stage and with people who are passionate about theatre, and they become like family for me. But I think once you leave, you can never go back home. And I experienced that for the first time when I went back after a few years. I just could not understand what was going on, and that's great for the writer. It's terrible as a human being.
Yeah, like as a writer, it's good to know a place but stand kind of on the outside of it because you're an observer, but then you never feel that belonging anywhere. Oh, that's so sad. You want to lay down?
No, maybe later.
And now your mother has moved to India, but your father is in, or your mother moved to Canada and your father's in India, so even more.
He refuses to come. He's come here twice, and every time I ask him, so do you want to come next year? Yeah, I'll come. You guys go. I'll come. So
he doesn't come.
No.
And your mother doesn't want to live in India?
She prefers it here now. She likes it here. So, yeah.
And I was talking to my writing group about how you live in both places, and someone referred to a picture book in which someone goes back and forth. I think it was between Japan and Canada, but always there's a part of their heart in each place. So if you could talk about, do you have a part, what is it that feels like home in India versus what feels like home in Canada, or what makes you feel more connected to each place?
Well, all my writing is set in Bombay except for certain parts of this book. But all my family, members are there, my cousins, all of them, everyone's there. And what I love about Bombay is you can, at 2 a.m. you can decide, well, I want to meet someone. And you just pick up the phone and you have people awake at that time. And there's no, well, let's meet next weekend and let's have dinner. It doesn't work that way. Like you meet someone and say, hey, what are you doing later? Okay, come on. That's it. And there's no planning, and I just like being awake and catching a cab, at 3 a.m. Sometimes I'll do that. I won't be able to, if I can't sleep in Bombay, I'll be like, well, I'm not going to stress about it. I just walk outside, I catch a cab, and I just go somewhere. And that's one of my favorite things to do in Bombay, is sit alone in a taxi with the windows down and just watch the city and make notes. And I used to walk.
And there's a character in the book that loves taking taxis everywhere. Yeah, because he can't sleep and he likes.
Yeah, and I love walking, and through the city at night and early morning, seeing it when it's empty. And for years, I grew up very close to Bombay's red light district, and that's my novel, The Parcel, is set. And for years, I would just walk through the red light district at different times.
That's safe?
You don't think about it because it's where I grew up, so you kind of. But people who haven't been to it are always that, why are we here? I would just walk and make observations and sort of listen in. And there was this amazing. Once a week there's what's called a midnight market or sabkuch. Sabkuch means everything. You get everything there, and it's stolen goods, it's second-hand goods, and it's from midnight till 4 a.m. Like you can and you get everything from binoculars to globes to records to shoes to crutches, like bizarre. And so I had never seen that, and I sort of one day, and I needed to see it for the book because I needed I knew something was said
for the parcel.
Yeah, for the parcel, and so my dad and I went. He knew kind of where it was, and my dad's very adventurous and he knows stuff in Bombay because when he grew up, he knew the city really, really well. That's what I love about Bombay. It's completely deserted. We're in the red light district, and suddenly you see like 200 people on a small field selling stuff like lights, flashlights. It's just bizarre, and I love that.
Busy,
Doesn't happen in
and I was
Vancouver.
awake. And so what is it that keeps you coming back to Canada? What is it that you get in Canada that you can't get in India?
I think I found my home in terms of the work here. Like the theatre, you know, I went to UBC as a student, I did my MFA in creative writing, I found, you know, my editor.
Oh yeah, you love your editor.
Yeah, absolutely. They make you a better writer. You know, so all of that is Canada. And
Are you're more well known in Canada as a writer than you are in India?
I think so.
But do you write in both places equally easily?
You mean like
When you're writing, like just sitting down and writing?
Initially, I used to not write much when I was in Bombay. It was more a place for research. But the more time I started spending there, I realized I had to write, and now I can write
everywhere. So this is a personal question, but I already told you I'm going to ask you whatever I
Sure.
feel like. So when I met you before, you had a girlfriend in India,
Yes.
and then you didn't, and then you'd be here 6 months, and she was there 6 months, and you're trying to make that work. And now that, so how do you have relations? I mean, in your book, your character says he'd rather be buried vertical alive than talk about the M word. So I'm kind of projecting that onto you. Is it do you find marriage is at odds with the artistic life you want to have, or is it living back and
that's a
forth?
fictional
Liar.
character.
Liar.
No, it just hasn't happened. But with relationships, you know, if it's long distance, it's just the worst.
And that's really long distance.
Yeah.
You, I'm going to try to ask this without sounding jealous, but you said you found your home in the theater community. What about the writing community?
And the writing community as well, of course, yeah. And what I mean is like literature, storytelling, that sort of thing became my home.
Both of them. Because you have lots of great writing friends in Vancouver and BC that
Yeah,
must feel like
sure,
home
yeah.
too. I mean, we would miss you if you left.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this book is really interesting in that it's a plays with autofiction. It starts with a story that feels very autobiographical. The character's very close. And then it has a bunch of fictional stories about people between India and Canada, or people of Indian descent in Canada. And then it ends with something that is blatantly nonfiction, where the character is an ocean, he's traveling back and forth, so a true story. And then at the end of the first story that seems true, it says, bridges are not connectors, they do not join, they are simply ways to pass over. And what we pass over will come back to haunt us. Please follow the bridge or pass over until you arrive at Translated from the Gibberish Part 2 on page 197. So these stories are a bridge from one, and I don't quite understand what you're doing, but I like it in the sense that, James Joyce, when he finished Ulysses, he said, oh, this will keep the critics thinking for a while. So I felt like, oh, Anosh is giving me a challenge to puzzle this out, and I could read this a few times, and I could teach it, and people could have different opinions. And so part of me wants to say, explain what you're doing, but that kind of defeats the whole purpose. But do you want to talk a little bit about the structure and what you were...
Sure, and this is where an editor comes in, and the conversations with editors are really valuable. Because I wrote this and then we decided to break it into 2 parts.
Oh.
And,
remind me your editor's name. She's very famous.
Lynn Henry,
Lynn
she
Henry.
is very famous. But she's, it's, the things that editors do is they kind of, again, it's the same thing what dramaturgs do. They're able to see what you're trying to do. And they articulate it for you, and they present a question to you. They never tell you what to do. They just tell you what if. And then you start thinking about that what if, and you come up with maybe a third option, or you follow that option exactly. But what we wanted to do was, offer readers a chance to read the stories through and through, or go straight to part 2 and then come back to...
Oh, like I could have skipped.
You can skip,
Oh,
yeah.
no one told me that.
Because that's, very Canadian of you. You like being lying.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's fascinating. I mean, it's very, very honest. And I'm going to get him to read some in a little bit, but I think I had one more. Oh, no, I don't think I did. So that answered my question. So that was originally the part 1, and part 2 was written as one piece.
Yes.
And you changed it a little bit because you don't use your name now in the first part,
No.
but you use your name in the second
Yeah,
part. So the second part's more blatantly nonfiction, but originally it was
Maybe,
one
but a
essay.
lot of it is, the thing with, autofiction is you can never tell what's real and what's not. And
Oh, that's
the
what I
whole
wanted to
point.
ask you. So can you define autofiction for them?
It's still fiction.
It's still
It's still fiction.
It's fiction about yourself.
Yes.
Yeah.
Auto is,
So Rachel
Auto-
Cusk or the people who more seem like they're writing about their own
yeah, and then there's, yeah.
But they're
But
fictionalizing.
it's presented as fiction, because if it's non-fiction, then you can't make anything up. And really, I was just speaking earlier with someone, there's a difference between fact and truth. Fiction,
Is there?
I think so.
Okay.
Facts can be really boring.
Yeah.
The
Oh, my
truth
dad always
isn't-
says never let the truth get in the way of good
The
stories.
truth,
They can
the
tell.
truth is seldom boring. It's one of my favorite quotes is from Tennessee Williams, and when he was asked by a critic why his plays are shocking, he says, I don't write something that's shocking, I just tell the truth, and the truth is shocking. And that's the thing, you're going for a higher truth, an emotional truth, some kind of spiritual truth. Whether it's fiction or non-fiction, you're aiming for truth. The facts are boring.
Is writing hard for you? Like when you sit down to the page and you're like, okay, now I'm going to say something true, and therefore it's going to be worth reading, and it's going to be shocking, and it's going to have that energy. Is that hard?
That's not how I think. I always sort of ask myself, what is it that I'm trying to investigate? What does it mean? Why am I telling this story, and what will I find? I never know what I'm going to find. And what you find, that's what I mean by something being truthful and character driven. You're trying to investigate something. And you keep hearing this thing, write what you know, write what you know. Well, it's true. You start with what you know to discover what you don't know. And that's, you start with something that is familiar to you, that has a pull that is calling you, but you don't really know what's behind it. And that's what I'm interested in going after. And to answer your question, is writing difficult? Of course, it's always difficult. It's one of the hardest things that you can do, because you're doing it alone. And there is no final answer when it comes to writing. It's not mathematics where you get it wrong or you get it right. You'll never know.
Based on your acknowledgements, I feel like having an editor that you've worked with for a long time and depend on makes it a little bit easier. Like one that you have built the trust with.
I think I wouldn't say easier, but what it does is it gives you a lot of confidence. So, for example, once I decided that I was going to write the Parcel, and I knew what the story was, which is, I'll probably talk about that tomorrow and read from it tomorrow.
But they have it here, and it's a great book.
Yeah.
Which was shortlisted for the Writers' Trust and the Governor General's.
And once I met my editor a few years ago, and she said, okay, what's the next book? And I said, this is what I want to do, and she wanted to talk about it more, and I said, I only have an opening line. I go by many names, none of my own choosing. And she said, that's great. I said, thank you, and that was it.
That's it.
And when we continued, having conversations over the next few months, and that's my process with her. We talk about the book. And there are many writers who will not do that with their editor, but I like doing that. I'll call her up and I'll say, well, it's kind of evolved more. And I haven't written a word, but I've made tons of notes. I think the writing gets hard if you start too soon. If you're not prepared, if you haven't done your sort of character work and you just land up there.
You have to have that build-up of energy where you're dying
You have
to
to
get it out.
you have to almost not write,
Yeah.
which is different from procrastination. Totally different. I'm writing all the time. When I'm out, I'm writing. When I'm at dinner, I'm thinking, you're dreaming. And you have to allow things to sort of come to you. You can't demand it. This lovely quote by Harold Pinter is one of my favorite playwrights, and he was working with an actor on one of his shows, and Harold Pinter also wrote poetry, and so did this actor. And the actor said to Pinter that poetry is like a cat; it will come to you only when it's ready. And it's very true. Writing comes to you when you can't demand anything. You cannot.
But you can show up at the page every day to earn those good days.
You just dig. You just keep digging. Your job is to just investigate and say, what does it mean? I don't know.
Speaking of writing all the time, even when you're not writing, I recently went on a road trip with Michael Winter, and he's one of the kind of writers who has a notepad all the time. So it was 4 writers we were going to Stephen Heighton's funeral, unfortunately, but he would just pull out his notepad. So you'd be talking and you'd be doing stuff, and all of a sudden Michael's scribbling something down. And you'd start to be like, what are you writing? Like, give me that, right? Because he's taking notes on everything, and you never know when something's going to pop up in his book.
I understand, but I don't like. One of the things I love doing is when I go to India, I spend a lot of time with my cousins and my dad, because they're great storytellers. And so it's not so much about note taking, it's just about observation and listening. Because if I find if I start taking notes and I'm missing something that is the actual
truth
thing that I should be paying attention to. So I'm just very present and I just listen. And sometimes an image will just really just stay with me, and it refuses to leave. And when that happens, it's a gift. When something refuses to leave,
then you know that's the
you
thing.
know that's.
I read somewhere that you can teach someone how to write a short story, but when they decide to write a novel, you just stand on the shore and wave goodbye. So I have this idea of you saying that line to your editor and her saying, yep, that's a good trip to go on.
Yeah.
Bye, good luck, bon voyage.
But it means so much, because she's giving you that confidence that, okay, this is a great beginning.
Yeah.
And now go and do your thing and see you in a few months or years.
Yeah. Will you read a bit from this is the first time I've been able to, I like to interview writers like this a lot, but this is the first time I've been able to tell him what to read. I said, can I tell you what to read? And he very agreeingly let me tell him. So here he goes.
Sure. So this is from the opening story, translated from the Gibberish. This is the autofiction, and I'll just read an excerpt from there. I once had a yoga teacher who would use the word exile when he meant to say exhale. This was because of his accent. I was still in Bombay before leaving for Canada 20 years ago. I had a perpetually blocked nose thanks to a deviated septum, and my family doctor, Dr. Hansotia, sent me to this man. Exile, 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 the teacher would say, letting out the breath from his belly and mouth at great speed, encouraging us to do the same. I found the idea of breathing in a closed space with 15 other humans quite repugnant. All those germs moving around with the arrogance of frequent flyers, threatening to enter whomever they chose. But the word exile stayed with me purely for its comic effect. Back then I hardly knew what exile meant. Little did I know that the word would enter me more than any other germ, cause me to sneeze, writhe with fever, laugh, dance, dream, cry, to who knows what as time went on, as a result of hurling myself from Bombay to Vancouver like a swashbuckling pirate. Now my swagger has gone. Some time ago I came upon this passage by Edward Said. Exile is strangely compelling to think about, but terrible to experience. It is the unhealable rift forced between a human being and a native place, between the self and its true home. Its essential sadness can never be surmounted. The achievements of exile are permanently undermined by the loss of something left behind forever. This is a terrible piece of writing. Terrible in its truthfulness, in the feeling it evokes, in its ability to both ask a question and then conclude, without question, that there is no solution to its pain. It left me feeling weak and angry. I have been moved by literature time and again, inspired by its awesome power, such as when I first read A Fine Balance by Rohinton Mistry, or Flannery O'Connor's A Good Man is Hard to Find, or Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. These are stories that contain truths. This passage, however, was truth that told a story, my story, and I couldn't bear to hold it in my hands. 20 years of being in a foreign land, and instead of gaining something, I was being told that I had lost. I cannot remember my yoga teacher's face, at least not entirely. I remember his nostrils and his mouth, but not the eyes. He almost never opened his eyes. I have a feeling he was from Kerala and was stuck in Bombay. He was expressing, through his nostrils, what Said had written. The self and its true home was so far apart that only breathing could calm him down, smooth out his anxiety. I didn't know at the time that he was offering me a tool, a coping mechanism that I could use in Canada. Dr. Hansotia hadn't sent me to him because of my deviated septum. He'd sent me to this man because he somehow knew that my leaving India was going to cost me much more than international student fees. Why are you going, he asked me when I went to his clinic for a final checkup just before I left. I still remember the day and date, August 11, 1998. It was a Tuesday. I was set to leave for Canada a week later. I'm just going there to study, I said. Study what? Creative writing. You want to be the next Tennessee Williams? No, I said. Son, are you sure you want to become a writer? A writer? Who said anything about becoming a writer? What the hell was this guy talking about? But of course, secretly, that's what I had decided. I just had no intention of announcing it to anybody. To say it would make it real. This was my dirty little tryst with destiny. Perhaps back then I didn't understand the seriousness of my undertaking. I was about to lock horns with something that was larger than me, more powerful, and completely dangerous. I was on my way to becoming a flammable object. That's what writers are. And I knew I had it in me, this innate ability to combust. Writing isn't about prose. It's not about stories, plots, characters, themes, images, ideas, and certainly not about redemption. Do you have the ability to combust, to implode time and again, day in and day out, with the stamina of an athlete, until you have written that novel of yours? Once the book is out, even if it gets great reviews, this still doesn't prevent your nerves from being on fire, because the next story has already come along. It's already spewing and vomiting inside your gut. It knows that your ability to combust is far greater than your capacity to heal. Maybe Dr. Hansotia saw that in me much more than I did at the time. I was, as they say, full of the arrogance and exuberance of youth. And in the 3 years since I graduated from university with my BCom, Bachelor of Complacency, I had grown shadowy. I no longer lived in the light. I stopped playing football, stopped going to nightclubs, avoided large crowds, felt pissed off hearing laughter. I just stayed at home and stared out my window into the dark at the glow of lumber mills and cooking fires. But I wrote nothing. I didn't know how to. I was seething. The fury was building and I had to leave. That's all I knew. Leave. If I had stayed on any longer in Bombay, I would have had a motorcycle accident or gone to the red light district and smashed a pimp's head with a bottle. Just make sure you do yoga, said Dr. Hansotia. Keep doing it there, it will help you. In other words, make sure you breathe. Yes, I said. As soon as I landed in Vancouver, I inhaled. On that very first day, I took such a deep breath that my lungs were shocked by the purity of the air, the sheer audacity of oxygen. I continued doing yoga breaths for a few days. Then I told myself that if this was the quality of the air around me, I wouldn't need yogic breathing. After Bombay's smoke-filled, polluted death offering, this Vancouver air seemed like a trick. It was, and I fell for it.
I found reading this whole book really emotionally intense, and there's a lot of comedy in it, but sometimes I'd be thinking, this is so funny, and I'd be laughing, and I'd want to read sections to people, and then all of a sudden there'd be a line that was so dark and jarring that I thought, oh, maybe it wasn't funny. Maybe I read it wrong, but I think you do that. You're juxtaposing emotions really intensely. So can you talk about how you use comedy and how comedy works in this?
Again, I think that just goes back to one, being from Bombay, and secondly, growing up, in the family that I grew up with. My dad has a great sense of humor, very dark, absurd sense of humor. My cousins, my uncles, wonderful storytellers. And I think I just grew up around the tradition of oral storytelling. And it's hard to explain, but in Bombay you grow up very quickly. Especially at that time, you can't shield yourself
from the harsh
from anything. You just can't shield yourself from it. And my parents were wonderful in that, nothing was forbidden. Absolutely nothing. So I ended up not having a rebellious phase in the sense, I did, odd stuff. I continued to do that. But it just made me, the family stories, having grown up very close to the red light district, you find humor in very dark moments. it is a way of survival. It's a coping mechanism, but it's also an absurd and wonderful lens through which you see the world. I think everyone in my family is some sort of clown.
Mm-hmm.
And the one thing I did notice though as a kid was the mask. There was a lot of pain, but it was as though they suddenly put on a mask and now there's no pain.
Right.
And then you notice someone in a corner and the mask has come off.
Well, sometimes the mask shatters and then it's like it's funny,
Yeah.
but it's not funny at all.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it, even poetry, if you look at it, it's the element of surprise, right?
Mm-hmm.
Your language takes you by surprise, storytelling should take you by surprise. I also feel that this is what theatre, teaches you. And when I, wrote my first play, the character of Top Rani was someone who had been castrated as a young boy,
Mm-hmm.
and now he's a grown-up man who runs a brothel, and because of what had happened to him back then, and now he still considers himself as a man, even though he's wearing the garb of a trans person, but he still considers himself as a man. And for him, he was a very funny character because nothing was sacred anymore.
Mm-hmm.
If this was what was done to me, I can laugh at anything.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I was writing. So it's really the worldview of the characters that inhabit my work.
Mm-hmm. Paul Corrington was a very funny writer, and when I met him, Can Lit wasn't very funny. Canadian literature was not known for its humor. And I asked him about his humor, and he said he grew up reading Kurt Vonnegut and Philip Roth, and he just thought it was part of the job description. If you're going to write, you better be funny. But his humor is very different than yours, and I like the way you just described yours. But for me, I just like to laugh, and so if I'm gonna, and I think now it's so much dark, so much heavy, so if you can just let that as a release once, and I think Kurt Vonnegut said laughing is what you do, or laughing or crying is what you do when there's nothing else to do. So there's a similar
Right.
response. It's a release of emotion.
Sure, but I didn't really, grow up reading
That
anything.
anything.
I was not much of a reader.
What?
I love comic books, but I was more into sports and I don't think I would have been a writer if I didn't have the parents that I do, the cousins,
Storyteller.
and if I didn't grow up very close to the red light district. I think coming from that, time and place made me a storyteller. And I think when it comes to writing, especially theatre, it's a technique where essentially it's like you invite someone in, you say just please come in, please have a seat, you make them feel really comfortable, and then you punch them in the stomach.
Mm-hmm.
Because
Yeah, that's how I felt reading
if you
this book. That's
see
what
me
I
coming,
did.
you're gonna just do that, but you're like,
Yeah.
please have it. And that's maybe the humor, the lightheartedness, the whatever, and then you take the air out of them, and then you make sure they're okay again.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And then you say, "Oh, that won't happen again, my mistake." And then
Don't
again,
press them.
you do that all over again, right? But by then, they really care enough, they're hooked in, they're committed to the characters, and they can't leave.
Carol Shields said the job of the writer was to startle and illuminate, and I feel that's the surprise that you're talking about, right? And I feel that rhythm throughout this: illuminate, startle, illuminate, but it's a much more intensified version. I wanted to talk, so because of the autobiographical bookends, I was really tempted to read you into every story, so I'd be like, oh, I didn't know Anosh was a swimmer, oh, I didn't know Anosh was in the circus, like I was reading him into every story.
I'm a terrible swimmer, unlike you.
You're not in the
You're a
circus?
professional swimmer. But here's the thing, there was a moment in my life when I actually wanted to go to clown school.
Yo, you did?
I wanted to, in France, because it sounded fancy. And I also knew I would never do it. So I kept saying, well, unless I can go to France, but there's a part of me that loves, watching clown work. Not the red nose, not that kind of stuff, but the idea of a mask.
It's more clown
And
like
what
that.
we do, how we use a mask. We do that all the time in our lives, right? We keep putting on these masks again and again and spend your whole life just unpeeling, right? Or a moment comes and suddenly it's stripped off. That's I'm interested in that.
I feel like we're running out of time and I have 5 million things I want to ask you still, but one of the themes, I'm getting the 10-minute signal. One of the themes in your book I see running through it is about happiness and whether or not we can be happy and what happy means. And I know I read somewhere, I think it was a Buddhist sort of text that said happiness isn't the goal is being useful. And I found that reassuring, because I'm like, okay, I can work at being useful easier than happiness seems less in my control. But it seems like you're saying something more complex than that. Can you talk about the role of happiness, maybe specifically in the artist's life or the writer's life?
I don't know if it's, I don't think happiness is even achievable, like I don't know what that means.
You know what happiness means? I'm going to get him to lay down before this is over.
There are moments, there are moments, I know what laughter means.
Yeah.
I know what it means to be fully alive in a moment, but it doesn't mean it's completely happy. Because there will always be something that is some sort of pain, right?
Contentment?
I love the idea of contentment. I think the last time I was really happy was when I was a child. I have to be honest and say that I think it was a long time ago. Yeah. But what took that notion away was the idea of impermanence. And I realized that
specifically?
Not even death so much, although I was very aware of death at a young age, but I think because, I was an only child, so I had a lot of time to think. But also having a large family, I loved being surrounded by a large family with all my cousins and aunts and granduncles and all the alcohol. I'm the only one who doesn't drink, but my God, those guys could drink. And there was always so much food and music and dance, and it was just, and I loved those moments. But I remember very clearly the first time I thought as a child, this is not going to last. And the idea of impermanence, the minute I understood that, it's freeing, but it also makes you constantly aware of, while you're in the moment, you know this moment is already gone. And it's a terrible way to live, but that's how I live.
Your book is also very bookish, like you're in conversation with other books, whether it's Raymond Carver or Hinton Mystery or Edward Said, or it's very much in conversation. And I wondered if I feel the sense that even though you said you didn't read as a child, now you're well read and books have meant a lot to you. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely. Yeah. I want to read much more. I don't think I'm...
Because can you talk to a book like a Fine Balance and say what that meant to you as a writer?
That was a book when I read when I was in India in my early 20s. And I was just I started entertaining the notion that I had this weird thought that I am a writer. It's not about I want to be a writer.
Kate Harris has that thought, I think, so maybe we'll hear that in the second half too, but I remember her talking about feeling like a writer before she had published or...
Oh, but it wasn't even before, I hadn't written anything.
I'm a writer.
I had not written a single short story. And I'm not joking, I just felt, I think I'm a writer. And I didn't tell anyone what that meant, but I thought, well, if writers write novels, let's read one. And
it seemed like a good place to start. Taking notes, read novels.
And my girlfriend at the time, her father was a great reader, and so was she. And I had read Goenka's mystery short story collection when I was 15, thanks to my dad. But I was too young to really engage with it, and so I read a Fine Balance, and I think it was the first time I understood the power of literature. Where you just hold a book and it literally was doing that to me.
Yeah.
And by the end of it, I just couldn't speak, and I thought, oof.
Yeah.
It's one of those moments where you look around and you don't know what to say to anyone. There was no one to talk to, but it's just you feel that force of storytelling and language and character, and I didn't have the articulation at that point to even understand what I had just read, but I knew that that's what and then I read The Stranger by Camus and Hunger by Hansen, and I remember reading the poets Akhmatova and Wisława Szymborska, and then that was once I came to Canada. I just started reading and writing because I was so lonely and isolated. That's all I would do. I would just go to, and I had no one to tell me that these are the classics, because I didn't have a literature background. So what I would do is I would go to a used bookstore, read the opening paragraph of a novel. Like I remember reading Camus' Mother Died Today, or maybe it was yesterday, I don't know. And I thought, wow, okay, I'm going to buy that book.
Yeah.
And it's always, it's very, the first 2 pages will reveal something.
A Fine Balance had the same effect on me. I always say that when people would ask me, what's your favorite book? I thought, how could you possibly answer? There are so many great books, because I was a real bookworm as a kid, and then I read A Fine Balance, and I was like, this is my favorite book.
Yeah.
And I think if you could put in words exactly why, then you wouldn't need the book to
It's
extend
really,
it.
it's just the simplest way to say it, it really moves you.
Yeah.
And we sometimes, I'm not interested in clever writing, I'm not interested in cleverness. I don't want to dazzle anyone with, my intelligence, not that I have that much, but I don't want to be dazzled by your intelligence either, I'm not interested. Move me with your humanity, just do something where I feel, things have moved inside my body, and intelligence does that much, where you can say, oh wow, that's a great idea, and that's really an engaging idea and worldview. But when you are emotionally shattered, I think that's great, because now you're broken open, and that's what art does.
I'm not going to ruin that with another question. It was a beautiful idea. The last section of this book, I almost wanted to get him to read the end, because it's one of the most perfect endings I've ever read, but of course you want to read the end when you get to the end. So I highly encourage you to buy the book and have Anosh sign it and read it yourself. Thank you all.
Thank you, Angie.